as we learn in our story of a bank that is no longer with us, the Knickerbocker Trust. New York at the turn of the century, financial capital of America. It was money that kept New York moving and growing, money that built its elevated trains and skyscrapers. And most of the money that built New York came from the banks, of which New York boasted hundreds. From the powerful national firms on Wall Street to the more modest banks like the Knickerbocker Trust, which served the city's neighborhoods and its people. Working class families who kept their savings in the Knickerbocker. Storekeepers who dropped off their daily receipts there and borrowed at the Knickerbocker to buy merchandise. Wealthy matrons who used their checking accounts to shop Fifth Avenue. Captains of industry who invested their corporate profits at the Knickerbocker Trust. And as banks have done for centuries, the Knickerbocker held only a fraction of its depositors' money in reserve and loaned out the rest. For instance, Wall Street analyst Henry Kaufman explains how a bank earns money.
Banks tended to earn money the same way as they do today in a general way, by making loans and by making investments. There was perhaps in those days, in hindsight, a somewhat greater risk-taking than has tended to occur within the last 40 years or so in the United States or in banking in modern times. It was and had a stronger entrepreneurial drive in those days, and at the same time there was inadequate governmental supervision.
Charles Barney, the Knickerbocker's president, was one of those entrepreneurs ambitious for his bank's success. Apparently, for Charles Barney, the chance came along to make a lot of money. That is, if he was willing to take some major risks with the bank's money. Barney had connections with a speculator named Charles Morse. Morse and a partner, Frederick Hines, headed a scheme to manipulate the price of copper on Wall Street. Copper was a hot item that a number of people were speculating on in those days. There is debate, historically, over the extent of Barney's involvement, but many believe he made the behind-the-scenes arrangements as the Morse-Hines Combine began setting up its trap in early 1907. Historian Robert Sobel explains.
Hines came to New York, where he met Morse, who was a small-time speculator. He was behind the American Ice Company and a few other companies like that. And their plan was to get 4 or 5 banks behind them. And once they had the bank's assets, to use it to create a new copper company, United Copper, push the stock up, squeeze the shorts, that is to say, squeeze those people who sold the stock thinking it would go down, and make themselves a bundle. Perfectly legal for that period.
What happened?
The stock market at that time was heading downward because of this money crunch I mentioned just briefly before. That is to say, the economy was overheating. Many people were frightened that perhaps there'd be a crash. They were taking their gold out of the banks. Most people knew the Knickerbocker was part of this group. And when United Copper started to collapse, they put 2 and 2 together. Depositors started to appear at the Knickerbocker with those pieces of paper, as I said before, gold certificates, written by the Knickerbocker and said, give us our gold. And the money starts flowing out of the Knickerbocker. Now, under normal circumstances, had the Knickerbocker been just a major bank, they would have gone to Morgan or someone else and said, help us out of this, otherwise there's going to be a panic.
On Sunday, October 20th, Charles Barney left his home here on Park Avenue to try to borrow the cash he needed. He went to appeal to the only source that he knew could save him, J.P. Morgan. Morgan had helped banks in trouble before. He was one of the few men with the resources and reputation to do it. But when Barney got to Morgan's headquarters here at his library, Morgan wouldn't even see him. For Barney, disaster was now inescapable. The rumors took on a life of their own. Monday, the runs on the Knickerbocker began. Depositors panicked and tried to withdraw their savings. Tuesday at noon, the Knickerbocker's cash was gone, and the panic spread to other banks until 246 banks across the country closed, their customers out of luck. J.P. Morgan, realizing the entire system was threatened, not to mention his holdings, finally stepped in to end the panic of 1907. Under his leadership, a large reserve fund was put together. Then, facing appeals from banks and trust companies and brokerage firms, Morgan met with a group of New York City bankers in his library. Together, they often worked through the night. In fact, it's said that at one point, Morgan locked them in while they argued over which firms to save and which to let die. Morgan played solitaire at his desk until they made their decision. Morgan had saved the day, as a grateful nation acknowledged. But the costs of the 1907 panic were high, as it affected banks and businesses and personal lives, including that of a disgraced, distraught Charles Barney, who killed himself. Ironically, the Knickerbocker Trust was not a bad bank. It was to reopen 5 months later, and the people who frantically lined up along here got most of their money back. As for the nation's bankers, they had to face two important realities. Could they allow the power to save the banking system to remain in the hands of a J.P. Morgan? What would they do if a J.P. Morgan wasn't there? The bankers turned to the federal government for help. They accepted the need for a central bank. The other important reality was that despite all its inherent instability, neither the bankers nor businessmen wanted to give up fractional reserve banking. Economic analyst Richard Gill explains why.
The reason why bankers wouldn't want to give up a fractional reserve system is pretty obvious. It's because they make money by lending out their depositors' money. Is this somehow sinful? Hardly. Banks are commercial enterprises. If they didn't make money on their loans, they'd have to charge us hefty fees to hold our deposits for us. Most of us, I suspect, would regard this as even more sinful. The Knickerbocker case, naturally, was a bit alarming. But the fact is that most of the time, fractional reserve banking works well. In its simplest form, a commercial bank's balance sheet might look like this. We have two columns here, assets and liabilities. Roughly speaking, assets are what the bank owns, and liabilities are what the bank owes. In this stripped-down case, the bank's assets consist of cash, money we have deposited in the bank, and its loans to businesses. This bank owns a claim of $80 million against the industrial firms who have borrowed money from the bank and will pay interest back to the bank. Against these assets, we have what the bank owes to its depositors, what we call demand deposits, since they are, in principle, payable whenever we write a check on them, that is to say, on demand. And what fractional reserve banking means is not that our assets exceed our liabilities. As you see, they balance here at $100 million, but that the bank's demand deposit liabilities exceed the bank's cash reserves. The fraction here is 1/5. Now, what the Knickerbocker case shows is that there is an inherent vulnerability in this kind of banking. If this bank's $80 million in loans turn out to be bad loans, it can get into serious financial trouble. Even if the loans are okay, the bank can get into bad trouble if people believe it is in trouble. If everybody wants their cash on demand, obviously our bank is not going to be able to satisfy them. Believing makes it so. But this same principle also explains why the system usually works just fine. By believing our money is safe in the bank, it becomes so. Most of us never even think to ask our banks to show us their balance sheets. Not knowing, we have no need to know, most of the time.
25 years after the panic of 1907, the country was torn and nearly overturned by the Great Depression. Not only did banks fail by the thousands, but many felt the banking system contributed to its collapse. How could this happen? And could anything prevent it from getting worse? The Federal Reserve, Washington, D.C. The central bank, in a sense, was a kind of institutionalized J.P. Morgan. It was intended as a lender of last resort, loaning money to banks such as the Knickerbocker Trust, which were basically sound but temporarily in need of shoring up. All of the nationally chartered banks were automatically members of the Federal Reserve System, and many of the state banks joined as well. Did the Federal Reserve work? Well, through the 1920s, there were few complaints. In fact, the presence of the Federal Reserve in part reflected and in part reinforced the optimistic view of the times. The banking system supported the boom of the 20s. In fact, it increased the amount of money in circulation during those years. How did the banking system create money? Well, by making loans. As a loan was granted, credit was created, and more money flowed through the banks. It had a multiplying effect. Workers earned their wages, and the wages went into a bank, where it could be loaned out to other people to buy cars, and more money flowed through the banks. Auto company profits could then be invested in steel mills, and so it would go, more and more money flowing through the banks. Would we grow forever? Henry Kaufman explains why most Americans in the 20s acted as if we would.
When you get into an economic expansion, the commercial banking system or a financial institutional structure can aggravate problems by becoming too liberal in its loans, allowing a liberalization in credit standards. Now that immediately drives the economy very sharply, but within time adds to problems.
Banks gave liberal loans to investors. Investors in turn speculated wildly on the stock market. Wall Street boomed until Black Thursday. October 24th, 1929, the inevitable happened. The market fell. The crash pushed the country into the Great Depression. Americans felt the pain of an economy grinding down, the money in circulation virtually drying up. Workers lost their jobs and took their savings out of the banks. Loans weren't made to industry. They were called in. Many losses couldn't be recovered. People weren't looking to buy new homes or cars or furniture. They were lucky to hold on to what they had. The economy hurt the banks, and the banks hurt the economy. Historian Eugene White explains.
The problems of the banks began to feed the fires of the Depression, and it worked through a multiple credit contraction. That is that once a bank began to cease to make a lot of loans, when it began to increase its reserves, not make new loans to new customers, an increasing number of businesses began to fail, and other businesses couldn't pay back their loans. That meant that many banks found that their loans grew weaker, and they contracted even further. So it was a real slow unwinding of the system of financial intermediation.
Well, what was the Federal Reserve doing at this time?
What the Fed was supposed to do was to engage in a counter-cyclical policy to counteract the trends in the economy. But instead, it, at the beginning, began to play a very neutral role. And just like the banking system slid very slowly into chaos.
Once again, panic took hold. In 1930, 1,000 banks failed. In 1931, more than 2,000. In 1932, the American people looked to new leadership to lift the country out of its economic crisis.
I propose to show that this leadership misunderstood the forces that were involved in the economic life of the country. It encouraged speculation and overproduction through its false economic policy.
The incumbent president, Herbert Hoover, was to be routed at the polls by Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
This great nation will endure as it has endured. First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In his inaugural address, Roosevelt pledged to establish strong banking safeguards.
There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
Responding to the urgent need, one of Roosevelt's first presidential acts was to declare a national bank holiday. Merritt Sherman, who was with the Federal Reserve at the time, tells us why Roosevelt took this course of action.
What Roosevelt was trying to do was to create a period in which the whole banking system, individual banks, could be reviewed by bank examiners, by experts who had a great deal of information about banks, and enable them through the procedure of licensing banks to reopen, to carry out the promise made by the president that any bank that was reopened would be able to stay open.
In his fireside chat, FDR announced to the people that the reopened banks were safe.
Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs. And it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime.
And Roosevelt did more. Legislation following the bank holiday extended the powers of the Federal Reserve, forced banks to meet tougher regulatory standards, and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to guarantee each customer's account up to $10,000.
Give him my 60 cents.
How am I going to get 60 cents?
Here's my bank book.
All right, that's fine.
5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60. That's okay.
Americans showed their faith in the reopened banks and the crisis passed. The bank holiday was a watershed in the Depression and is remembered as one of the most popular political moves by any president. The action was unprecedented, but Richard Gill, was a bank holiday really necessary? What had happened to the money supply?
Well, the money supply shrank drastically between 1929 and 1933. But you have to understand that by money supply, we mean not just coins and currency, but also our checking accounts in the banks. In fact, since we make most of our major purchases by checks rather than cash, these bank deposits are by far the most important part of our money supply. And a point not all of us may be aware of is that commercial banks can actually create these deposits, actually create money. This really does seem a bit much, but in fact, it's a simple consequence of our old friend, fractional reserve banking. Let's follow through $1 million new deposit of cash in the banking system. Let's suppose there is a rich widow who, frightened by the panic of 1907, has been keeping her $1 million in cash under her mattress, hopefully not in $1 bills. And now, in the roaring 20s, she deposits this million in the bank. The bank has $1 million more in cash, and she has $1 million demand deposit in her name. Now we get to the fractional part of it. The bank lends out, say, $800,000 of this to businessmen. And now the businessmen withdraw this money, so that our bank now looks like this. But what do the businessmen do with this money? They pay it out to workers, landowners, and so on, who deposit it in their bank. So now we have a second bank that has a new cash deposit. Its balance sheet looks like this. But now the second bank, on the familiar fractional reserve principle, lends out most of its new cash, say $640,000. Its balance sheet now looks like this. But hold on a second. Look what's happened. There are now $800,000 more demand deposits in the economy. $800,000 more money in the economy. We have the original $1 million in the first bank, plus $800,000 in the second bank. And you ain't seen nothing yet, because this $640,000 that the second bank lends out now becomes a cash deposit in a third bank, and so on, and so on. We have had, by the time we are finished, a multiple expansion of money throughout the economy, or a multiple contraction of money, because the same process can also work in reverse. Not only can, but did during the Great Depression. No wonder Roosevelt called for a bank holiday. No wonder our money supply collapsed so completely.
Where copper was the lure for speculation in 1907, 66 years later, it was oil. Beginning with the Arab embargo in 1973, oil prices quadrupled. The riches of oil brought wildcatters to the western fields. The risks were high. If they struck black gold, a fortune would be made for the wildcatters and for a certain bank in Oklahoma. A bank in Oklahoma City called Penn Square jumped for the brass ring. It courted the so-called new oilies until 80% of its lending was concentrated in oil and gas. The strategy seemed to work. Penn Square built itself up from a relatively small and conservative shopping center bank to Oklahoma's fourth largest bank, sitting on assets valued at $500 million. How typical is this story in the banking community? We asked Robert Dins, former deputy controller of the currency.
The peculiar laws of the banking of the United States, which, under the McFadden Act, which prevent banks in Oklahoma at that time from branching, meant that the only way that Penn Square could grow was by buying loans from oil patch producers and selling those loans all over the United States. They were taking all the loans that the other banks, the more conservative banks, weren't taking. And it was all premised on the idea that somehow oil in the ground was good collateral, and oil was very good collateral for a loan at $40 a barrel. Well, of course, as we all know, since that time, oil has fallen down to $29, $28 a barrel. And what was good collateral is no longer such good collateral.
Could it have been successful?
It could have been successful if the oil crisis hadn't just plain disappeared. They were big crapshooters, and they rolled boxcars. And that's, of course, not the way to run a bank.
Penn Square went bust. The run on the bank was reminiscent of the 30s, but now government reforms from the Depression included an insurance program to protect customers. Well, if this had happened back in the 30s, there'd have been a line not only outside the Penn Square, but banks in 4 adjoining states. Why didn't it happen this time?
Well, I think the public has a great deal of confidence in the Federal Deposit Insurance System, that we're not going to allow major systemic problems to develop because we do have an examination force and a monitoring system and the like to stay on top of problems and not let them get too large. And then secondly, once we do see a problem, we react very decisively. We get the bank closed and merged into another institution, and depositors are protected.
I want you to get to your neighbors and tell them that FDIC is operating this bank. We've got $11 billion backing up your deposit.
The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation acted promptly to reassure the concerned depositors. Chairman Isaacs explained where Penn Square had failed.
People of the FDIC are not the source of your problems. Let me be blunt about who is. The Penn Square debacle was caused by a gross dereliction of duty on the part of the bank's management and board of directors.
We're obviously most concerned about this from the consumer's point of view. Did their money, was it always safe?
Well, up to $100,000 per depositor, you have full FDIC insurance coverage. So if you're dealing with less than $100,000, you have no worries. Even if you have more than $100,000, you can get substantially more protection. We are determined at the FDIC and throughout the government that there will never be another banking panic, and we will do whatever we need to do to keep that from happening.
The other 15,000 banks in the country held secure, and confidence in the banking system was maintained. How do economists view banking safeguards? Richard Gill offers this analysis.
I think all economists would agree that the system is vastly safer now than it was in the early 30s. The insurance of bank deposits by the FDIC is obviously very important, but the Fed is also far more sophisticated than it was 50 years ago. Does this mean that a collapse like that of the panic of 1907 or the Great Depression can never happen again? Never, as the saying goes, say never. Still, it's a reasonable guess that banking crises in the future, if they occur, will at least be much more contained than in the past. As another saying goes, so far, so good.
We have seen why the government stepped in to support the banks after the panic of 1907, and how the safety net was reinforced in the Great Depression. Since then, we've had more than 50 years of virtual security for the banking system. Of course, there can't be any ironclad guarantees that the safeguards will protect us from any trouble that may come up in the future. But it does seem we can depend on two things: The first is the public has clearly recognized the importance of the banking system to other businesses, to the growth of the economy, and to their own security. The second is the government, going back to its original commitment in 1913, has shown an increasing willingness to do whatever it takes to keep our banking system safe. I'm David Shoemaker for Economics USA.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information on this college telecourse, video cassettes, off-air videotaping, and books based on the series, telephone the Annenberg CPB project at 1-800-LEARNER. Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker. What is inflation? Well, here at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they measure inflation, in a sense, with the Consumer Price Index, totaling the cost of goods and services and then comparing them from month to month and year to year. We've all felt the effects of inflation. There are those among us who can look back nostalgically on the days of the 3-cent postage stamp and 25-cent movies. When prices go up just a little, we're not surprised. But when they get out of hand, well, then we sit up and take notice, as we did in the late 1960s when prices began spiraling upwards. What caused that spiral, and how did inflation get out of control? As the country grew and expanded in the 1950s, no one was very worried about inflation. Then, late in the decade, the economy began to cool down, and that became a factor in the 1960 elections.
I'm not satisfied to have 50% of our steel mill capacity unused. I'm not satisfied when the United States had last year the lowest rate of economic growth of any major industrialized society in the world.
President John F. Kennedy called for a new frontier, a new era of energy and spirit.
The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s.
This new activist approach was to be reflected in economic policy. Walter Heller chaired the Council of Economic Advisors in the Kennedy administration.
Kennedy was the first Keynesian president. It isn't that others hadn't done some Keynesian things in terms of the way they managed the economy, but Kennedy did it in an avowed and in a perceptive way. He was very cautious at first, and it took a while for him to see that a more liberal approach was needed to stimulate the economy.
It took the form of a massive tax cut proposed in 1962.
This net reduction in tax liabilities of $10 billion will increase the purchasing power of American families and business enterprises in every tax bracket.
But John F. Kennedy didn't live to see his programs enacted. Instead, on that fateful day in November, Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Johnson pursued Kennedy's economic proposals and pushed the passage of the tax plan through Congress. How well did it work?
Perfectly. The Business Week, which is not exactly a liberal pro-Kennedy publication, said that it probably was the most successful tax cut in history. In a sense, you know, it came out of the textbooks, and in a sense it went back into the textbooks as the fiscal measure that came closer to carrying out what people had projected for it. In terms of the economics of it, that was a tax cut that worked.
The economic policies of the Kennedy-Johnson administration had succeeded in stimulating demand, creating growth in the economy. Business was booming, jobs were plentiful, and unemployment was near an all-time low. But many observers, including the President's Council of Economic Advisors, were now concerned about the appearance of inflation as the economy heated up. James Dusenberry recalls.
But in 1965, the real aggregate demand was rising at annual rate of nearly 8%, and it was continuing to rise into 1966. And that's what produced the high capacity utilization, the rising raw materials prices, and the decline in unemployment, and accompanied by labor shortages.
Many economists felt a tax increase would take money out of the hands of consumers and business. Spending would drop, inflationary pressures would retreat. But even as the tax measure was debated, new inflationary forces were about to be unleashed by the White House. Lyndon Johnson didn't want to be bothered by warnings about inflation. Lyndon Johnson had a dream of a great society.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
LBJ began to build his great society. But the big ticket item in the federal budget was not the war on poverty. It was the war in Vietnam. The Defense Department told the public it was spending about $1 billion a month. As we were to find out later, it was costing more. In fact, between 2 and 3 times more.
We were not really fully aware, not even his economic advisors in Washington, let alone those of us who were outside consultants, were not aware of how much Vietnam was going to cost. So we were taken unawares for several months. But by December of 1965, still early in the game, when the president had me come down to the ranch, I urged him to go for a sizable tax increase. And he said, Walter, I've checked on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress, and he said, I don't think I could get a dozen votes.
The whole problem stemmed from the kind of war this war was. It was a war that was never declared a war, and one of the main problems about it from the beginning was the idea that we would sort of run it on the cheap. That was one of Lyndon Johnson's great points, was let's try to run this war without letting people know we're at war. He wanted a silent, invisible war, and so therefore he did not want to raise taxes. That was just a total anathema to him. He wanted to do the guns and butter. He wanted to have the domestic programs, and he wanted to be able to run the war as well.
The stage was set for the surge of inflation. In the absence of a tax increase or any other effective restraint, consumers and businesses kept spending. At the same time, the government kept spending. So businesses operated close to capacity and labor approached full employment. To meet the demands of the marketplace, expensive new factories had to be built, and competition for workers bid up wages. In short, the demand exceeded the economy's ability to supply, and everything began to cost more. Finally, the president declared a one-year 10% surtax. But was it enough? Was it in time?
I don't think he wanted to fight for a tax increase on the backs of an unpopular war in Vietnam. And so that was held off until 1967, not enacted till 68, and the horse was out of the barn.
In the 1960s, we had a classic go-go economy. Consumer demand ran at a feverish pitch, as did government spending. And that began a cycle of inflationary pressures that would be with us for a long, long time. But does it have to be that way? Does a booming economy necessarily go hand in hand with inflation? That's a question we put to economic analyst Richard Gill.
In the 1960s, most economists would have said inflation occurs when the total, the aggregate demand for goods and services in the economy is expanding faster than the aggregate supply. Everybody wants more goods aren't available, prices go up. Mind you, this was the period when Keynesian analysis was at its height. These are simplified Keynesian-style aggregate demand and supply curves, similar to, but of course not exactly the same as the curves we might draw for a particular product, say refrigerators. A major difference is that here we are dealing with supply and demand for the total output of the nation, its GNP. And on the vertical axis, we are now measuring not the price of refrigerators, but the price of output in general, that is, the price level. Let's concentrate on one feature of these curves, the shape of this simplified Keynesian-style aggregate supply curve. You'll notice it is drawn quite flat through most of its range until we approach this line, which represents full employment GNP. And then suddenly it goes up quite sharply. Suppose we start here, far from the full employment line. Our level of GNP is quite low, our price level here. We now try to increase aggregate demand. The tax cut of 1964, giving more income to consumers, would be a perfect example. What is the result? GNP now goes up, meaning more production and jobs for everybody. But the price level remains the same. We have growth without inflation. But now look at what happens when we start over here. This is what we were facing in the late 1960s. Demand was already high. The Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson had been launched. And now along comes the Vietnam War, and suddenly demand is given a big shot in the arm. Our aggregate demand curve shifts up here. And look at the difference. All the effect of the increasing demand goes into higher prices. We are already producing at the economy's capacity. Supply does not increase. We have entered the world of demand-pull inflation. Now, Keynesians felt that the economic cure was simple. Lower demand by raising taxes. If a tax cut can raise demand, a tax increase can reduce demand. How well this Keynesian-style remedy would have worked, we can never know for certain. It wasn't tried. What is certain is that inflation was to become, in the years following, a much more complex and painful phenomenon.
Inflation, a source of anguish and despair for many, as it undermines purchasing power and eats away at savings. It's hard to plan for inflation, and when it spreads rapidly, many are unprotected, particularly those, like these people, on fixed incomes. But as destructive as inflation can be, there are those who benefit from unexpected rising prices. Just who are they? One answer may surprise you. People in debt can gain from inflation, and the great middle class traditionally goes into debt to buy a house. So, when interest rates on existing mortgages are lower than the rate of inflation, homeowners win. They pay back their loans with cheaper, inflated dollars. At the same time, their property values rise. Along with millions of other homeowners, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson found they had a windfall from inflation.
I realize that inflation has been a serious problem for many people, but it really hasn't affected us too much. With our house payments remaining essentially constant, the interest rate, it was an FHA loan of 5 1/4%. We're just fortunate that inflation really hasn't bothered us very much.
And there were other winners as well. This wave of inflation coincided with the credit boom of the late 60s. Consumers were urged to buy on credit, and inflationary psychology emerged. Buy now before prices go up, pay later with cheaper dollars. Consumers were spending money, and the increased demand was creating lots of jobs. So businesses would seem to be winning, but many soon had second thoughts.
Well, business does not fare well overall during periods of inflation. At the initial stages of inflation, when it's increasing, some businesses think they are better off because profits seem to rise. What you have is a situation where your inventory cost is low, where you have purchased goods at some previous time period. Then suddenly inflation comes along and you're able to raise your prices. So it looks like you get a bigger profit. But all of a sudden your costs then begin to soar. You have all this uncertainty which comes along, and suddenly most businesses find themselves far worse off, and that often leads us to recessions.
Among those clearly worse off from inflation were senior citizens. For the most part, they lived on fixed incomes. They had no extra money to cover even a small price increase. How could they meet raises in rents and heating bills or food?
It seemed that when you became old, if you had not been fortunate enough to put aside or prepare to take care of yourself when you were aging, that you didn't deserve any better. And that was a common feeling.
But the seniors had the power to organize and to make their voices heard.
In those marches, we achieved recognition that Social Security was still inadequate. Our long goal was to try to secure a way in which we could link the consumer price index to regular increases so we wouldn't have to go and beg Congress and beg an administration which maybe was conservative and didn't want to give us anything. We felt that if that was automatic with the consumer price index increases, that would be much better. It would be less political. And we finally achieved that.
Others hit hard by inflation were the working poor and the unemployed. Most of the little money they had went for the necessities of life. And the prices of those basics, of food and fuel and housing and health, all were rising the fastest. Like the seniors, the poor attempted to organize to keep pace with inflation. But their efforts were not as successful.
The senior citizen movement, in terms of participation, has been a much more effective movement than the poor. One of the problems with the poor is precisely that they're not organized, that they vote less than anybody else, that they join groups less than anyone else. The poor are not like the organized workers.
Even the organized worker was having problems keeping up. New York was only one city knocked on its heels as first the sanitation workers struck for higher pay. Shortly afterwards, firemen and police went out on job actions. Then came the transit strike and the teachers' strike. Each group, like so many other Americans, fighting to hold on to a decent living. We asked Victor Gottbaum, who represents public employees in New York, to recall those turbulent days.
I represent workers.
If they're taking a beating and they go into the supermarket, I hear about it. They don't make unfounded or, you know, loud demands. If a Vinnie Parisi, who's a sewer laborer, says, hey, Mary goes into that market, Vic, it's killing me. That's what I hear. If a hospital worker says, you know, it's becoming awful, that's what I hear.
Workers won higher settlements, but that raised costs and boosted prices. In all sectors of the economy, in all parts of the country, inflation had become entrenched. It was hard to keep up. It was harder to feel sure about who was winning. The cry to do something about inflation was coming from more quarters, and it was growing louder and louder. Was there any real hope that the inflation momentum would run out of steam, or were we just victims of our own expectations that inflation would continue? We asked economic analyst Richard Gill.
I would say that there was relatively little hope at this time that the inflationary momentum would run out of steam. You see, one thing that happens when inflation gets going is that all groups feel that they are losers. Sanitation workers, teachers, senior citizens, rich man, poor man, you name it. Everybody faces these higher prices and thinks, my God, I'm being ruined. Now, in one sense, this perception that everyone is losing is unjustified. If prices are going up, incomes are going up too. Not everybody is losing all the time. There have to be winners too. Still, when this uncertainty about the future becomes contagious, things can get bad for everybody. It's extremely difficult to run an efficient, productive economy when prices are changing all the time. But whether justified or not, this fear of falling behind can unquestionably be a major factor causing inflation to increase. The sanitation workers feel they are falling behind. They strike and get a higher wage. But now other public employees see that they really are falling behind. They demand even higher increases. But now other workers, coal miners, assembly line workers, sales clerks, see that they are falling behind. Up, up we go. Wages, prices, prices. The spiral is upon us. How on earth can it be stopped? By the end of the 1960s, the question was not only real, but urgent.
President Johnson had been able to shrug off the importance of inflation. But by early 1969, when the inflation rate climbed to over 5%, it could no longer be ignored. Both the business community and consumer groups demanded that something be done. The responsibility was left to the White House and its new occupant, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
The primary responsibility for controlling inflation rests with the national administration in its handling of fiscal and monetary affairs. That is why...
But would this president be more willing than his predecessor to accept the traditional Keynesian approach to reduce demand by increasing taxes? Chief Economic Advisor Paul McCracken explains Nixon's reluctance.
I don't know of any political situation short of a war where there isn't enormous hesitancy about increasing taxes. That's about the least popular thing that the political system wants to hear.
And increased taxes, after all, were likely not only to cut inflation, but also to slow the economy. That was a sore point from Nixon's past. He believed the economic slowdown in 1960 had cost him the presidency, and his eye was now on the 1972 elections. Also, Nixon was a laissez-faire conservative. He feared that increased tax revenues would increase the size and the role of government. But if taxes were not to be raised, why not cut back on federal spending?
It would have been irresponsible to start out with a meat cleaver slashing everything, partly because I am sure that a year or so later, government would be hard at work trying to increase everything they could increase. Better to stay in the middle of the stream.
If increasing taxes or cutting the budget were unpalatable to Richard Nixon, perhaps the Federal Reserve could be enlisted to combat inflation. In theory, the rate of inflation is a function of the money supply. By restricting the money supply, inflation should also contract. The Fed cooperated. The result?
One thing that was expected then by economists was that the price level would respond to restraint, monetary and fiscal restraint, much more rapidly than in fact it did.
And so there was a tendency to say, well, the policies are failing.
Then, as the Fed's restrictive policies did take hold, the economy slowed down. Unemployment mounted. There was an outcry against this made-in-Washington recession. But inflation was barely affected. It was so entrenched that people expected it to continue, and it did. Could stronger medicine contain it? Critical economists and politicians called for the government to directly freeze prices and wages. Those controls had worked during wartime to stifle inflation, but they had never before been seriously considered in times of peace. Controlled wage and price ceilings interfered with the free market and the laissez-faire traditions of the country. On the other hand, elections were just 18 months away and something had to be done. But could a conservative president like Richard Nixon come to accept price controls?
The time has come for decisive action, action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days.
We were having an inflation before the controls, which was the result of the expectation that inflation would go on. So people were asking for wage increases in the expectation of inflation, and businesses were raising prices in the expectation of inflation in their costs. And the theory was that if you could just stop this process for a while, people would get over that expectation of inflation, and you could then resume a free market system with a low rate of inflation. But that didn't happen. We didn't change the expectations. We only created the expectation that when the controls ended, the prices would zoom again.
And prices did zoom up again when controls were lifted. Price and wage controls proved ineffective in the long run in stopping the spiral of inflation. And even when we did take inflation seriously, controlling it was more easily said than done. Was there anything that could have worked? Economic analyst Richard Gill offers his commentary.
The basic reason that wage and price controls were adopted was that the traditional Keynesian remedy for inflation, cutting back aggregate demand, suddenly seemed inadequate to our new situation. A Keynesian-style inflation, we recall, looks like this. Demand is too high, so we cut back, say by raising taxes, and we lower prices without having any real effect on GNP or employment. But suppose our aggregate supply curve is different from the Keynesian. Suppose that instead of this little upward curvature here, the whole supply curve looks like this. Suddenly, we are in a new world. Our prices are too high up here, so we cut back aggregate demand to here. Prices do fall, but, and this is a huge but, so also does our GNP. In simple words, to lower inflation, we have had to plunge the economy into a recession. We have had to trade off some of our employment to bring inflation down. Of course, these diagrams present an oversimplified picture of what was going on at the time. In a general way, however, we can say that by the early 1970s, prices had a tendency to rise well before full employment in the economy was reached. Inflationary pressures were being felt even when there was substantial unemployment in the economy. No wonder economists turned from Keynesian to other remedies. And sad to say, our problems were just beginning.
We learned the hard way that inflation can't be taken lightly. The boom of the late 60s may have had its positive aspects, lots of jobs and a growing economy, but the continuing demand pulled up prices. The spiral of inflation began and there was no quick fix. Once started, it perpetuated itself. We all learned to live with inflation, and for some of us, that meant learning to live with less. And as we were learning to cope with inflation, it was becoming more complex. By the 1970s, inflation was continuing to grow, but demand fell off, and the economy stagnated. Stagflation, a new problem, and a problem we'll consider in a future edition of Economics USA. This is David Shoemaker.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
For information on this college telecourse, video cassettes, off-air videotaping, and books based on the series, telephone the Annenberg CPB project at 1-800-LEARNER. New York, 1907. One of the city's major banks, the Knickerbocker Trust, closes. One man commits suicide. The banking system nearly collapses. What is it about the nature of banking that could lead to such a calamity? In the 1920s, the banking system helped spread prosperity. In the 1930s, it dragged the nation down. How could a holiday put an end to the deepening crisis? In the 1980s, it was still possible for a bank to fail. How had the federal government made good its commitment to protect the banking system?
Our nation has a long history of trying to protect the business of banking, but we've never eliminated all the risks. The banking system, why must it be protected? That's the question economic analyst Richard Gill and I will investigate on this edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker. America's businessmen and women know how dependent they are on a friendly bank for the success of their companies and the growth of their communities. And this country's banking system has provided that success and that growth for more than a century. Although most banks are healthy and long-lived, historically we have had to face the tragedy of bank failures. And while we can accept the failures of other businesses with a shrug, the closing of a bank is another matter.